Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to our third lecture in this series on Introduction to Family and Kinship in India. Today we are going to look at how the notion of blood is constructed within the anthropological study of kinship. The idea of blood is manifest and most important within kinship. We think of our relatives and our ties in kin through the idea of blood. Blood is not only that which flows in our veins, but has a larger notion. The saying blood is thicker than water has many meanings. It also means that kin always take care of kin. What is it about this idea of blood that makes it so essential to kinship? These and other questions are what we'll tackle in this particular segment. But before we go into looking at blood and its symbolism within Indian kinship, we have to look at the theoretical understanding of blood itself. David M. Schneider is regarded as the most important thinker within the anthropology of kinship. Schneider did what many anthropologists couldn't. He questioned the foundation of kinship itself. In his book, The Critique of Kinship, he questions the biological assumption that forms the study of kinship. He says that the idea that sexual procreation leads to kin is taken for granted in anthropology. And this taken for granted has led to millions and millions of pages of analysis and research on what kinship is across the world. As a universal truth, Schneider says that it cannot be taken for granted. To begin a discipline based on an assumption which is not researched upon or questioned makes that discipline in many ways not reliable. And this is what leads Schneider to think of and imagine kinship in new ways. The critique of kinship in many ways is also a stepping stone to his study of the American kinship system. In his book American Kinship, he looks at how American kinship is based not only on the idea of sexual procreation or the notion of what it means to be kin through marriage, but on the symbolic value of blood. He tries to understand how blood and its concomitant trajectories come to make up kinship. This is critical because he delves into what he calls the symbolic construction of kinship itself. He doesn't talk about sexual procreation, and he doesn't talk about how its taken for grantedness is the foundation of kinship. He talks about blood. So, Schneider says that within American kinship, there are two primary symbols that link relatives together. One is that of blood, or what he calls shared biogenetic substance, and the second is code of conduct. This is critical. Blood is not blood in Schneider's analysis, but a shared value. It is shared biogenetic substance. A long term like that carries many meanings. You have biology and genes coming together in a moment of sharing. Schneider is very clear that this shared biogenetic substance happens when a man and a woman come together to procreate a child. That bit we cannot forget. However, what the shared biogenetic substance means for a larger idea of kinship is what he's trying to understand. One of the things that he is very keenly observing about American kinship is that these two codes of shared biogenetic substance and code of conduct are linked in understanding what makes a person a relative. So, in American kinship and what becomes code for Euro-American kinship in later analysis that we'll look at in the following course, in the following lectures, the idea of a person as related to another person is through these two mediums. Now, what is code of conduct? Code of conduct, according to Schneider, is based on all relations that are laid down by law. The primary amongst this is that of marriage. Marriage or code of conduct is important, and in many ways marks the transmission of shared biogenetic substance. It may not also in many cases. However, the important thing about the code of conduct is that it is dissoluble. That is, a divorce can always break it. Or if you have adopted someone and then disinherited that person legally, that ends the relationship. The possibility of ending a relationship within code of conduct is always there. However, in case of shared biogenetic substance, the indissolubility of that relationship, makes it even more strong. What is it about shared biogenetic substance? Very important, and as we go into the other lectures, is the idea of sharing. You not only share blood or the symbolism of blood with your kin, you also share other aspects of relatedness. We will discuss that on the lecture with Janet Carsten and her idea of relatedness. But for the time being, for Schneider, the shared biogenetic substance can be traced through a very important idea, that of diffuse enduring solidarity. What is diffuse enduring solidarity? For Schneider, people who share biogenetic substance also share a sense of solidarity, togetherness, we feeling. This solidarity is not centered on a few people, but is diffuse and can be traced through generations. So a grandchild might feel solidarity for a grandfather, but he may also feel solidarity across his own generations to the fourth cousin. A fourth cousin the person may not really know about. This idea of diffuse enduring solidarity is also seen in emerging technological interventions in health. What a strange example to give, but actually one that makes sense. In recent studies, it has been found that many couples fearing inheriting the cancer gene trace their links to ancestors up to the third or fourth generation, or relatives they've never been in touch with, to find out if they might or can inherit cancer. In many ways, they are brought together to understand how this solidarity can work through shared blood or genes. Suddenly, blood is not as simple as water, is it? We are now looking at blood in a more different, in a more complicated idea. Schneider's notion of shared biogenetic substance does call out to blood, but has more complicated ideas attached to it. In fact, this whole notion of symbolism that he takes on later becomes the rallying cry for very important ideas that are studied within Indian kinship that we'll discuss now. But before I go into the discussion of blood and symbolism in Indian kinship, what is important to understand is that Schneider's idea of shared biogenetic substance comes to mark two very important things. First, the construction of the idea of the person, and second, the whole entry into the study of symbolic value within kinship. Now, what is the idea of the person that we are talking about? Is it just a person as itself, or a person in relation to other persons? This is critical, since Louis Dumont, who we have talked about earlier, said that caste in India stems from the idea that the Indian person is someone who is within the community, that the West and the East are different because Western individualism does not nurture togetherness, whereas Indian community nurtures not only togetherness but a sense of hierarchy which is complementary. I do not want to go into details of Dumont's analysis of the caste system here, but suffice it to say, this analysis marked the way in which we think about the East and the West as critical junctures in which persons and their individuality is made. For a long time, the idea of the Eastern person has been one who lacks any sense of individuality and is embedded in the community and the family. To a large extent, this is true. This is also evident in the way in which we think of the individual in India as dividual. Anthropologist, sociologist Malcolm Marriott talks of the dividual Indian person. In his exploration of the idea of Indian ethnosociology, Malcolm Marriott says that the Indian person is not an individual but a dividual who exists in relation to others, who exists as a person in many forms. So you're not always just known by your name. You're also known in relation to your parents, to your friends, to your spouse, your girlfriend, your siblings. This is important because it makes up the Indian person. You're not just your name, you're also your caste, your religion, your community, your ethnicity. Think about it. We always come with these other identities attached with us. It makes us and it also breaks us. That is not to say that the Western individual does not come with these identities, but a sense of the individual traced and developed in the West is one who works through two major symbols. One of being linked to a family and the other of being an individual in his or her own right. That is also very evident in Schneider's analysis when he says that code of conduct and shared biogenetic substance are two split identities that mark the Western person. They are separate from the Western person as he or she is. So as a relative, the Western person will always remember himself or herself in relation to shared blood or in relation to shared legal relations. And as an individual, he or she will remember himself or herself in terms of other achievements that he or she has undertaken. Again, that does not mean that the value of the family is not as important for the Western individual, but that it is not over-encompassing of the person's complete identity. Whereas in the East, according to McMarriott, the Indian person is an amalgamation of his or her community, ethnicity, and family identity. Another example here to further drive home the point that Marriott is saying is how marriages in India are between two families rather than between two individuals. When you arrange marriages, two families come together to arrange the marriage of their son or daughter. It is never a marriage of two individuals alone. The big fat Indian wedding is a very good example of how diffuse enduring solidarity works and of how shared biogenetic substance and code of conduct come together. But most importantly, we must now talk about how the idea of symbolism comes to impact Indian studies of kinship and family. In the study of Indian kinship and family, most importantly, the idea of symbols works best when looked at in relation to what Monica Bock and Aparna Rao called the procreative ideologies. Both of them in their seminal volume on nature, procreation and culture talk of how certain ideas from Schneider's symbolic theory on kinship are used then to develop and think through the idea of procreation. What is procreation again? We are going back to the assumed nature of the sexual act, which leads to the birth of kin. But what is also important here is how we think through these categories. Thus, the most common idea that is prevalent within, for instance, the analysis of North Indian kinship is that of the seed and the earth. It's a very simple notion, but it encapsulates the idea of how sexual procreation leads to the birth of a child and decides which clan or group the child belongs to. The seed refers to the father's contribution, and the mother is the earth or the vessel that carries the seed. It's a very agricultural form of analysis, which Leela Dubé refers to in her study of anthropology and gender in India, and talks of how it embeds and qualifies inequality within India between the gender and sex relationship. However, what is important is that the seed and the earth symbolism is not restricted only to India. It is found also, as per Carol Delaney, in Turkey. It's a common notion which is found in different parts of the world. In Turkey too, the seed and the earth refers to the act of the male contribution to the birthing and identity of the child, where the mother carries the male sperm. Now this is interesting and how it develops an idea of kinship and family. It is also linked later and which develops into a larger theory of what is known as ecofeminism. Ecofeminism, lauded and started a few decades back, actually set an agenda for environmental activism where women could be involved. Why am I bringing in ecofeminism here? Because ecofeminism too draws from the symbolism of the seed and the earth. Vandana Shiva, one of the exponents of ecofeminism and perhaps the founder of the early thought process of ecofeminism, talks about the Hindu concept of Prakriti and Purusha. Prakriti is of course Mother Earth and Purusha is the human race, or in many ways the male essence. And it is in the coming together of these two that Earth thrives and develops and procreates and reproduces. It's the protection of these two elements that is essential to actually protect our environment. So the seed and the earth symbolism is essential to understand how we think about our relationships and our community through simple acts and through the idea of symbols. Blood as a symbol exists in very important ways in this. The first important study of seed and earth is done by Akos Ostor and Lena Fruzzetti in an article published in Contributions to Indian Sociology. They look at Bengali kinship in particular, which comes under the Indo-Aryan or North Indian kinship system, to understand how seed and earth has larger ramifications for the idea of kinship itself. As mentioned earlier, seed and earth carries with it certain basic conceptualizations. It means that the man's identity is primary for the child, and that the mother carries this identity for her husband and for her child. The mother's role is definitely diminished to that of one who carries the baby and gives birth to it, while fulfilling the demands and the values of the patri clan, something we have just studied in the last lecture on Dravidian kinship. Let us look at the image of Bengali kinship. Now, if you can see, according to Indian and Nicholas, the big group of people in Bengali kinship are known as the Atyo Shojon, or one's relative. The Atyo Shojon are primarily divided into three groups: the Emni Shomporke Atyo, or just so relatives, right here, the Atyo or one's own, and the Nijer Atyo, or relatives based on behavior, attitude and sentiment. These are interesting categories. Fruzzetti and Ostor also talk about them and further develop them. The Atyo or one's own is primarily divided into two groups: Rokto, which in Bengali means blood, and Biye or Kutum, or relatives by marriage. The Rokto or blood relatives are further divided into far or dur and nikot or near. Now this can be a generational rule, or it could be within the same generation, it could be two generations. This could also be in the same generation or distant generations. So just to give you an example, the nikot would include your grandfather, grandmother, so your grandparental generation on both sides, your parents, your father and your mother. It might include your cousins up to the second level or the first level, depending on what you value. And it could also include other sets of people who are closer to you but are ambiguous in terms of their blood relation to you. We will discuss about that later. The dur, on the other hand, may include cousins who go up to the fourth or fifth or even third level, depending on proximity, and might include ancestors, your great grandparents, your great grandfather, your great grandmother, of whom you have no recollection, but who are important, most important for life cycle rituals. Now, the nikot are most importantly identified as Bongsho or Kul, the descent group which is patrilineal in orientation, passed down through men. And the Bongsho and Kul is a very important category. If you think of the Bongsho and the Kul, in Bengal in the early 18th century, when colonial rule was at its height, the idea of the Kul was also to mark out purity in descent. The Kuleen Brahmins, one of the most famous Kuleen Brahmins, actually two of them, one is Rabindranath Tagore and the other is Ram Mohan Roy, actually marked engagements in terms of marriage and descent, and this is critical. So the Kul and the Bongsho is not just limited to your immediate descent group, but might have larger ramifications, thereby questioning the idea of nearness and distance. This is something to remember, that even though there is a categorization and a tree for you to think through, there might be various permutations and combinations to this. Now, if you are looking at the far, there are three sets. The Sapinda are up to the 7th generation, the Bhayat are closely linked brotherhood, and the Satpurush are descendants up to the 7th generation again. Now, the Sapinda may be those who link through 7 generations, and the Satpurush are actually the 7th generation ancestors, I apologize. this link is also important because they become important during life cycle rituals such as death and marriage. In Bengali kinship, the tie of marriage and the ritual of marriage is very complicated and always involves remembering your ancestors through these practices. Let us go back to this interesting category of Nijer. In Bengali, Nijer means your own, which is also interesting when you link it to Attiyo, and also interesting when you link it to Nikot. Nikot is near, but may also have an interesting relationship with Nijer, because your Nikot might also be your Nijer, and your Nijer might also be your Nikot, if you understand what I mean. The Nikot Attiyo, in terms of this diagram, are of primarily two types: Para Shamporko, or neighborhood relatives, and Dharma Attiyo, or those who are relatives through a particular tie. If you remember, in our first lecture, I spoke about fictive kinship. Within fictive kinship, the idea of the Dharma Attiyo is very important. As I said, the Guru Shishya is one example of Dharma Attiyota or fictive kinship. In this can also be the Rakhi brother, who you tie Rakhi to. It's an important relationship because it carries with it many connotations which do not link it to Rokto, but are nonetheless very, very, very important. So in this understanding of the Nijer is excluded from Rokto. However, not being blood does not mean that you cannot be close, as can be seen in these relationships of neighborhood and spirituality or fictive kin. These may not really be fictive in the real sense when people come together. What is of importance in the understanding of Bengali kinship system is that these sets of Attiyo Shojon come together with different sets of rules, regulations, roles and responsibilities, like any other relationship. But the symbolism of blood or Rokto carries through and has permutations for all sets of people. In my analysis of rites of passage and interpersonal kin relations in Bengal, I found that certain set of people who may not even be your neighborhood relatives perform a very important task during marriage rituals in Bengal. So for instance, the barber and the washerwoman belonging to a lower caste may not actually be your relatives in any sense, but have critical roles to play when you get married. The barber usually cleans and prepares the bride and the groom for their purification ritual before they get married. This is essential to any Hindu marriage rite. Similarly, the washerwoman cleans your clothes and prepares you, cleanses you, purifies you for the rite of marriage. Now, this is important to understand how we think about relations and relatives, and they don't always exist in a grid. So, they may not be blood or Nijer or Emni Attiyo, but they have very critical interventions to make at times where kinship is at its height, such as death and marriage. Again, the barber and the washerwoman come into play during death rituals. It's only after the barber cleanses you of the pollution that you have incurred through the funerary ritual that you become important to the understanding of how kinship works and you are brought back to the world. This is critical to understanding in how blood works. It's also critical in understanding how blood is not just shared biogenetic substance. So if you think about it, the washerwoman who washes clothes that carry menstrual blood is as intimate as the person with whom you share biogenetic substance. This is important as Bock and Rao call, in terms of what Bock and Rao call a processual idea of kinship. What is a processual idea of kinship? The processual idea of kinship takes into account the flow of different forms of kinning. It can be through feeding, through cohabitation, through acts of sharing things. It doesn't always have to be blood. As we go later into the idea of relatedness, we'll understand how this notion works and how it is important to understand and critically analyze the idea of working through the notion and symbolism of blood. In coming back to the idea of how symbolism and blood works within Bengali kinship, Eden and Nicholas developed a whole new idea and new approach to looking at Schneider's notion of cultural symbolism. They looked at marriage and death rituals amongst the Bengalis. They developed the idea of rites of passage as being critical to looking at how blood and marriage is worked through. This is not a novel idea. Victor Turner has looked at rites of passage or rituals that mark critical moments in life to talk about how rites carry within them certain ideas of social relationships and what is allowed or not allowed. For Victor Turner, rites of passage involve a critical overturning of certain relationships. They are also, most importantly, processual in nature. Victor Turner is especially taken in by the annual carnival that many societies celebrate. The carnival carries a lot of meaning and symbolism. The carnival is also meant to overturn accepted social hierarchies such as the rich and the poor or inequality for one particular day. We have many rituals like that in India, but particularly the life cycle ritual is important to understand how blood and other forms of symbolism work for kinship. In particular, in Bengali kinship, the idea of death and marriage is predominant, but so are other minor rituals such as birth and also initiation rites. Frazzetti and Oster look at particular rites which are designated to women and that are designated to men. These carry their own symbolism and meaning. Thus, within a particular spectrum, symbols of kinship abound. It's not just blood in its very limited sense, but in the larger idea of what blood really means. If we had to look at how blood comes to take the kind of permutations and combinations it does take, we have to also look at the very interesting book by Steve Barnett, Akos Oster and Lina Frazzetti called Concepts of Person. In one particular chapter, the three authors look at how the cultural construction of the person is marked differently in Tamil Nadu and in Bengal. Yes, we are back to Tamil Nadu as in relation to our previous lecture. But here the focus on Tamil Nadu and Bengal is in particular with the idea of blood itself. All three authors look at the idea of the bad blood. Can there be bad blood? Yes, there is bad blood. Bad blood is often a metaphor for feuds and conflicts. This is important to understand that there might be, and there is often, massive bad blood among kin. But here the authors refer to bad blood in a very particular way. They talk of bad blood in terms of what and who is important to the notion of marriage itself. We are also connecting this conversation to the whole cross-cousin marriage conversation we had earlier. It is important to understand that cross-cousin marriage is not just a structural principle or a practice, but also carries with it other symbolism. And Oster, Frazzetti and Barnett show this with great success. In case of South India, Oster, Frazzetti and Barnett talk about two forms of blood ties, two forms and symbols of blood that emerge again from a notion of procreation. In Tamil Nadu, unlike Bengal, there is no seed and earth connection, but the idea of procreation leads to the development of two forms of blood or essence, one known as Uttampa and the other referred to as Uyir. Uttampa is something that is shared, that is male aspect and is shared by both men and unmarried women to a particular caste ancestor. Whereas Uyir is something that women pass on to their, primarily to their daughters, which remains unchanged. Please remember this. Uttampa is something that the fathers pass on, a male essence, and Uyir is something that the mothers pass on. Interestingly, on marriage, the woman's Uttampa changes to that of her husband's kin, but her Uyir remains unchanged. This leads to an interesting set of relationships. This means in many ways that you cannot marry the person who has your Uttampa or Uyir. That in itself is incestuous. Remembering what incestuous means for us, this is critical. So, if we had to develop a kinship diagram of how Uttampa and Uyir works, let us say now, going back to our earlier understanding, this is the ego, and the ego is marrying, can marry this person. If the ego is fathers here and mothers here, and this is the mother's this is his sister, sorry, and this is the father's sister, this is the father's sister's daughter. She is perfect for marriage because she does not carry the ego's utampa or uir. How is that? She carries her mother's uir. Who is her mother? The father's sister. Now the ego does not carry the same uir, because while the mother has passed it, his grandmother has passed the uir exclusively to the daughter. And his father, well, does not have that uir in that sense. And they do not share the same utampa because her utampa has changed on marriage to the father sister's husband's utampa. So in many ways, she's perfect. Similarly, the mother's brother's daughter would also be perfect for marriage, because again, as the principle of cross cousins suggests, they do not carry the same utampa or uir. However, the problematic kin categories are mother's sister and father's brother. The father's brother will carry the same utampa, whereas the mother's sister will carry the same uir, thereby making any relationship with them incestuous. This is an interesting and an important way to look at the same cross-cousin principle that we have been looking at for the past 2 lectures. It brings in the question of bad blood and symbolism. It also brings into question how we think about procreation ideologies and how particular cultures carry their own sense of procreation. It is important that in the discussion of procreation and sexual relationships, and the act of giving birth is the most important act of making blood. You just do not have blood, you make it. A child carries blood within it. To a later discussion on commercial surrogacy, where I'll discuss further how this blood comes to mark the child, it is important to understand that the act of carrying the child or parturition also has particular elements of the blood. So even though a woman's role is diminished in relation to the man in the conceptualization of the seed and the earth, the woman still makes blood for her child in her 9 months of labor. This is also the first stage of making the child. The second stage comes during breastfeeding, when the mother literally transfers blood to the child through her breast milk. This is also the way in which kinship is made. These symbols are not something dreamt of. They are culturally important and resonant. They make people and persons. In an interesting example, if you had to think of the story of Akbar, you would know that Akbar's wet nurse was a very important person in his life. The wet nurse who breastfed him in his infancy actually has more of an important role in his court than his own mother, making it imperative to look at the importance of breast milk in making kinship. He gives her more importance than his own biological, and here biological is under scrutiny, his own birth mother. Similarly, if you look at colonial narratives of British children who were brought up by Indian ayahs and wet nurses, they always remember the relationship they had with their ayah. Even though the ayah didn't give birth to them or didn't transfer her breast milk, the ayah brought them up. That relationship for them becomes important and more significant than the one they had with their birth mothers, who are British white women. Indian ayahs occupy a very sentimental, important space in the narratives of British children who grew up in India. This is important in looking at how nurturing becomes an important trope and a symbol of making blood. It's not just breast milk or the act of labor, but also the act of feeding. When you feed a child, you transfer some of your own self to the child. This is something that we'll again look at later through Janet Carsten's idea of relatedness. But for the time being, the notion of symbols and how they're marked in kinship becomes very important. Back to the idea of bad blood. Bad blood, whereas in the Tamil system, works through this very interesting notion of cross-cousin marriage and inherited utampa and uir, in case of Bengal, becomes even more critical. Here, Rokto, again, similarly, very similar to the Tamil system, is passed in a way in which you can only marry certain kin. Whereas in Bengal, there is no system of cross-cousin marriage. Particular relatives, though part of a relationship or who can be considered as marital relations are still exempt from it. So within Bengal, you're allowed to marry kin if they're 7 generations distant. The mother's sister's son can be a valuable candidate for the daughter. However, the bad blood can also be transferred to the mother's sister, because even in Bengal, what the mother transfers to her daughter does not change on marriage. Interestingly, in Bengal, daughters may change their kul and their gotra on marriage, and gotra is very important here. As you know, gotra is the membership within Hindu society that you trace to your preceptor or the ancient saint who was linked to your family. In case of Bengal, gotra and kul, we already discussed kul was clan or descent membership, is often transferred on marriage. So a woman transfers into her husband's kul, bongsho and gotra, but her blood remains that of her natal kin. Her blood does not change. Her blood identity is that of her parents and of her family. Thus, marrying into the mother sister's family, even though they are distant and perfectly within the logic of wife givers and wife takers, mother sisters are also wife takers, mother sister's husband family are wife takers to the mother's family, they are still ineligible because the mother sister and the mother carry the same blood, which they transfer on to their children. This is particularly important in thinking about bad blood, because one would like to think about blood being as it is, but it is not as it is. Blood changes many of its meanings and permutations within kinship. This is also seen in new contemporary studies, especially one by Jacob Kopman, where he looks at blood donation in India and thinks of how blood can be marked when kin get involved. We have seen numerous Hindi films where at the critical juncture, the estranged relative, son, daughter, husband, father comes into the hospital and donates blood, which matches that of the person or the patient who's critically in need of blood. Here, blood is not only symbolism, it also means larger things. It means that you may be estranged, distant, different, but ultimately your blood is what is important. Recall, if you have not seen, and please do go see, recall the very important climactic scene from the film Amar Akbar Anthony, where Amar Akbar Anthony, 3 sons of the same woman who have been lost in their childhood and have been brought up by 3 different parents, one Muslim, one Hindu and one Christian, come back together in the last scene to donate their blood to help save their biological mother. It is both a parable of the nation and of an idea that blood is not only restricted to the family, but has extensions and ideas to the whole nation as well. That we all share the same blood and that we are all linked in a sense of humanity. This is critical again to look at how symbols operate in thinking about kin and in thinking about our idea and identity. Thus, our identity is not limited, as I say again, to just the close kin group. It develops and grows. The use of blood symbolism is very important here. In the rallying cry of "Mujhe khoon do, main tumhe azadi dunga" is very important of how giving of the blood is also giving of your loyalty, of staking your claim in the nation ideal. And the family in many sense, as they say, is the nation. So, and the nation is the family. So Schneider's development and idea of this theory of symbols and blood comes down and has various permutations and combinations that then develops and becomes and takes different trajectories of itself. This is critical in understanding how not only Bengali, North Indian or Dravidian kinship work, but that blood and rokto or khoon have different kinds of meanings and develop their own trajectories. As we go into the idea of blood further, I would like to talk about how blood becomes even more important in thinking about emotionally. Continuing with the idea of Bengali kinship, Sarah Lamb's study of widows in Bengal looks at the idea of Maya or Maya Tan. Maya, as we know, refers to the idea of illusion and has many different kinds of notions attached to it. But the idea of illusion marks kinship relations very particularly. Sarah Lamb talks about widows in a village in West Bengal where they are unable to let go of their worldly desires because of this illusion of worldliness, happiness and domesticity. And even though after a particular point of time, as you age, you're supposed to let go of the world and renounce your worldly affairs and go into sannyas, it is difficult to do so as the world and your kinship ties keep pulling you back in. This is a very interesting idea as it becomes more, as Sarah Lamb develops it. So in the village in West Bengal where she studies widows, widows are grouped into 2 or 3 sets of people. There is the married young widow, there is the widow with children and yet in her reproductive prime, and thirdly there's the aging widow or the aged widow. The young widow who is part of this larger discourse on child marriage and widowhood, which actually marked Bengali kinship and Bengali politics for a long time in the 18th, 17th, 18th century, is actually 18th and 19th centuries, is actually very important to understand how blood works. In case of widowhood in Bengal, any young widow who was in a reproductive prime, or in other words menstruating, could not be part of daily worldly life. She was a threat to the sexual order, to the idea of marriage, and because she was not with a husband or with any male kin, she had to be protected and put away. Sarah Lamb talks about how the whole persona of the young widow had to be changed. Her head was shaved, she had to wear white clothes, and she had to give up, most importantly, on warm food. She would have to have cold food such as rice or curd. Any warm food helps develop blood and sexual desire or heat within the body. This is important in considering that a young widow's sexuality has to be suppressed. She cannot go back to a life of the worldliness and of being married. She's a widow and she has to renounce it. For young widows, this is a difficult life, a practice which has been outlawed but still continues in many different permutations. Sarah Lamb's study done in the 90s, of course, builds on its own idea of what widowhood means. But of critical importance is the aging widow, who post-menopause has now become a woman who can now truly relinquish the world. Her heated body has gone, she has become cold, and there is no production of menstrual blood, therefore she is not of reproductive prime anymore and cannot bear children. She is, in every sense of the term, ready for the final stage of human progression of sannyas, where she must renounce life and go into the forest to find herself. However, what Lamb finds is that these elderly aging widows are unable to give up on the world. They are now finally in a position of authority, especially if they are mothers of sons. They are very important women who have a lot of authority in a patrilineal society. They have daughters-in-law to order, grandchildren to bring up, and the desire to relinquish the world and kinship and family ties becomes that much more difficult. When asked about renunciation, many of these aging widows talked about the pull of Maya, the pull of illusion, which they also called Maya Tan. And this is important because continuously the coldness of their blood matches with the warmth of their blood. So blood is not only bad or good, it also takes on different manifestations in how you live your life and how you are understood to progress through life stages, which is why the life cycle ritual continuously resurrects the idea of blood itself. Coming back to the life cycle ritual, it is important to understand that proximity to the blood relationship is what also defines which role you play within different marriage rites. This is particularly the case in Hindu marriage rites, of course. For instance, in the marriage ritual, the proximity to the bride or groom in terms of distance and blood often decides the critical intervention in different rituals. You must understand that in the Bengali marriage rite, the father in any North Indian Indo-Aryan marriage rite is the most important person. His act of kanyadan, or giving the virginal bride to the male kin of the groom, marks the marriage ritual. This transference is also a transference of substance. It's a transference of a human being, of a person, to bring forth children for the patri clan. Because the exchange happens, the father of the bride is able to give the groom side this big manifest gift by which they can bring forth their own progeny and their own family and descendants. This is critical, which is why it is marked, as I mentioned before, to the right kind of marriage exchange. In colonial Bengal and in the 19th century in Bengali society, particular matchmakers would actually come together to build genealogies and pedigrees to see who would be a right fit in terms of marriage. This is particularly important because they would build on an idea of who is likely to breed the proper descendants of a family. So purity, clan, and ideas of kinship again came together in this notion of blood. Thus the Kuleen Brahmins would only marry amongst Kuleen Brahmins. It was important for the right vessel to be there to carry the seed of the Kuleen Brahmin patri clan. These ideas seem archaic but are very relevant in today's day and society. In many ways, the idea of blood kinship has also linkages with the idea and notion of caste. Caste purity or caste endogamy is similarly linked to genealogy and blood. Brahmins, upper castes, and other castes all believe in keeping purity together. In many ways, recent contemporary studies, such as those done by Prem Chaudhary, look at how this notion of blood reemerges in conversations in North Indian states such as Haryana and Punjab, where honor killings are rampant. The notion of intercaste marriage also means a dilution in the quality of children that would be born because of the connection that blood has with caste membership. Thus, children have to be born through pure descent, which can only be possible in ways in which caste identity remains within the same group. So you must marry your daughter to the same caste, within the same caste. It is important here to also understand that women's role as vessels and carriers of the male clan is critical to deciding how blood identity is transferred. More than the West, in India and in South Asia, blood identity is linked again and again to clan, to gotra, and to the idea of caste. In Haryana, for instance, gotra marriages or the fear of saha-gotra marriages have led to many honor killings. Gotra again is not a relationship of caste, but one where you trace generational linkage to a spiritual preceptor. However, as per Hindu personal rituals and practices, marriage within the same gotra in North India is not allowed. It is looked down upon as almost incestuous because members of a gotra, even though they span geographical and spatial distances and cultural and ethnic variations, are nonetheless kin in many ways. In many ways, the idea of gotra, caste, kinship, and blood come together in very distinct ideas. And Schneider's notion of caste, kinship, through the notion of blood and code of conduct is particularly important when looking at North India. It is not to say that even though Schneider looked at only two forms of being in American kinship, its transference into looking at the symbols that mark Indian kinship and family are also very, very important. In analyzing the role of blood in creating different sets of relatives is also the notion of purity and impurity. We cannot forget how when we restrict marriages within caste or within the gotra, we're also looking at, as I mentioned earlier in case of the Kuleen Brahmins in Bengal, the idea of a certain sense of purity that is being passed down to descendants. In the West, for instance, racial purity has been always and mostly inscribed on blood. This is most peculiarly marked in cases of interracial unions. So for a long time, interracial unions were looked down upon. It is also found in how interracial unions carry with them the stigma of blood relations. Interestingly, Janki Ibrahim, in a study of Malayali kinship, Kerala kinship, looks at how a certain stain of white remains upon those children whose mothers, Malayali Keralite mothers, had relationships with colonial British masters. The pigmentation in their skin remains a reminder of the transgressions that were taken across race. It is not only a pigmentation of skin, but it takes on a stain in terms of the blood identity that the child carries. The child is not only an Indian or a Nair, but might carry the polluted, impure aspect of an interracial breeding. Similarly, in India, Laura Baer has studied how the Anglo-Indian community, which resided primarily in Calcutta during colonial India, actually carried the stain of bad blood or impurity through them in their interactions with Indian society. Many Anglo-Indians were neither invited into British white society nor were they welcome in Indian society, thereby marking them out in very distinct ways. Laura Baer's study of Indian railway narratives, where most Anglo-Indians worked during the colonial period, is telling of how kinship becomes especially estranged when the idea of blood is taken as polluted through different imaginations. Here, caste, race, nationhood come to mark out how we think of ourselves and our identity. Thus, blood is not just, and again, a pigmentation that is passed down, but makes for very interesting and compelling ideas about who we are and how we sustain ourselves. Interestingly, in carrying out the idea of blood, it is also seen, and this is something that we will discuss later, blood comes to mark also new reproductive technologies such as IVF, where couples, infertile couples, childless couples who are unable to have children through biological procreation, something that we have studied of right now, seek the help of technologies and other third-party intervention in the form of egg or sperm donors or a surrogate to have children. In such a situation, the child is permanently marked by the participation of a third person beyond just the mother and father. Here, kinship is particularly fraught and conflicted. The negotiations that happen in engaging with this third person, who may be anonymous or known, and his or her contribution to the birth of a child is something that Aditya Bharadwaj senses is particularly interesting. He talks of how the mother, father and the child are an important triad within Indian Hindu society, and the intervention of IVF technologies and of an anonymous sperm or egg donor or a surrogate marks the child in very interesting ways. One must categorize here the importance of distinguishing between blood, genes and biology. We will come to the idea of how blood, genes and biology marks kinship later, but for the time being, it is important to know that blood, biology and genes may all be subsumed in Schneider's idea of shared biogenetic substance, while at the same time being distinct in how they are understood in different cultures and different practices. Blood may have very ideological connotations, while biology may be more in terms of sexual relationships, and genes has come to be more medicalized and scientized in how it is imagined within kin relations. However, all three have the potential to subsume and transfer into each other their collective sense of representation. People think of all three together and they think of all three differently. But in kinship, the way in which the three interact is most important. In conclusion, I would like to remember how Schneider goes back to biology, the very assumption that he critiqued in his book Critique of Kinship. In his study of gay and lesbian kinship in the United States, Schneider talks of how gay and lesbian kinship is not alternative form of kinship or a new challenge to our biological assumption of kinship, but one that goes back to biology itself. Schneider speaks of how gay and lesbian couples, in seeking the intervention of new reproductive technologies such as IVF, in having children through their own bodies, which otherwise are understood as desexualized or non-procreative, are actually resurrecting the biological importance of blood and genes. They are not rejecting it, as Kath Weston says gay and lesbian couples do, but resurrecting their intimate sense of how they would also like to be linked to children through a notion of blood and genes. This is particularly important in thinking about how blood can never be really washed away. It is and it will always be part of a stain of what we think of our kinship relations, whether good, bad, polluted, pure or impure. Blood, genes and biology are essential to thinking of how interracial, across caste, across creed and across religion relationships are marked through a sense of intimacy that may not be found elsewhere. We have to also think of how kinship and family are deeply, deeply entrenched in the idea of blood, and it may take a long time to actually destabilize this notion, even though we are in the process of doing it. Thinking of adoption and fosterage is also very important here. They are not fictive in many sense, and yet they are fictive. we are also back to the idea of what fiction really entails. Aren't we thinking of how blood itself might be a fiction? How blood in its construction and ideology and how it's thought of within kinship and family relations is also a narrative that is built by different cultures, by different people, and by different relations. This is critical in understanding how kinship and family goes ahead with its own agenda and meaning. We have to think of how we can develop a more nuanced idea and theoretical conception of blood, whether bad, pure, or good. On that note, I would like to say thank you and see you again.